Welcome to Crypto Chronicles. We take these deep dives into the world of crypto and decentralized finance.
Yeah.
And today we're tackling this really interesting question.
Yeah.
What's the real story with Banks and XRP?
Right.
Are they actually using it, or is there something else going on?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah, and we've got some really fascinating material for this deep dive.
Yeah.
We've got analyses of Ripple's partnerships. We've got details on the technology behind XRP. And we've even got research into like the actual flow of XRP within its network.
It's interesting stuff.
Yeah, so hopefully by the end of this, we can give you a clear picture of where XRP really stands with traditional finance and what the future might hold.
Definitely. You've given us a really good set of sources to work with here.
Yeah.
We've got stuff on Ripple's partnerships with all these big financial institutions and really detailed explanations of how the XRP Ledger and the XRP digital asset itself actually work. Plus, we've got some research into how XRP moves around its network. And there are even some really interesting discussions about how smart contracts are being developed on the XRPL.
Yeah.
So I think we've got all the ingredients we need to really get a good grasp of this.
Yeah, I think so too. So right off the bat, one of the things that really jumps out from these sources is this crucial distinction between a RippleNet and XRP.
Oh, absolutely.
And I feel like that's where a lot of the understanding or misunderstanding really begins.
Yeah, I think that's a really important foundation for this whole conversation.
Yeah.
So RippleNet is Ripple's blockchain network. It's designed for enterprises, particularly financial institutions.
Okay.
And the goal is to make their payment processes more efficient and transparent.
So when we see these headlines about Ripple partnering with, major global banks,
Yeah.
does that automatically mean that those banks are actually using XRP to move money?
No,
Yeah.
not necessarily. And that's the thing.
Okay.
A lot of those partnerships that you see announced are about integrating RippleNet's features. They might be using it for things like better payment messaging or end-to-end tracking of transactions.
Right.
But those things don't actually require them to use XRP for the actual transfer of value or for providing liquidity.
So they might be using Ripple's technology, but not actually using XRP
Exactly.
to make those cross-border payments happen.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in fact, our sources say that only a handful of institutions are actually confirmed to be using XRP for what's called on-demand liquidity.
ODL.
Yeah, or ODL.
Okay.
And that's where they're using XRP as a bridge between different fiat currencies in real time.
So RippleNet might have a lot of adoption, but the actual use of XRP by banks for moving value is still pretty limited.
It is, yeah.
So why is that? Why are banks so hesitant to actually use XRP?
Well, there are a couple of big reasons that the sources point to.
Okay.
First of all, there are regulatory concerns.
Right.
The whole legal and regulatory landscape around cryptocurrencies, including XRP, has been changing a lot.
Yeah.
And in some places, it's still pretty unclear.
Yeah.
And that makes traditional financial institutions nervous.
Makes sense.
They're used to operating under very strict rules.
Sure.
So they're understandably wary about diving headfirst into something that's still a bit of a gray area.
Right.
And then on top of that, there's competition from other technologies.
So, okay.
Stablecoins are becoming more popular.
Yeah.
And they offer another way to do efficient cross-border transfers.
Okay.
And then you've got governments exploring central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs,
Right.
which could also become a major player in the digital currency space.
So banks have other options, and they're waiting to see how the regulations shake out before they really commit to XRP.
That's the picture we're getting.
Okay.
But there's also a lot of potential for XRP adoption in the future.
Okay.
If the regulations become clearer, that could be a huge catalyst for growth. And if banks start to see real cost savings and efficiency gains from using XRP for ODL,
Yeah.
well, then they might start adopting it just because it makes good business sense.
So it's not just about the partnerships. It's about proving that XRP actually works and that it's safe to use in a regulatory sense.
Yeah.
So there's this article from Digital One Agency that really emphasizes the importance of tracking the actual adoption of ODL.
Yes.
Like the real on-the-ground use of XRP for moving value.
Right.
Rather than just focusing on the number of RippleNet partnerships.
Absolutely.
So that's the key metric to watch if you want to gauge XRP's long-term potential.
Definitely.
Okay, so we've talked about the partnerships and the adoption. Let's dive into the actual technology behind XRP itself.
Okay.
What makes the XRP Ledger special?
Well, the thing is, the XRP Ledger, or XRPL, was designed from the ground up for payments.
Okay.
It's a really fast and efficient blockchain. Our sources say it can settle transactions in just 3 to 5 seconds.
3 to 5 seconds?
Yeah.
That's incredibly fast.
It is.
Especially if you've ever waited for an international bank transfer.
Yeah, those could take forever.
Feels like forever.
It does.
And it's much faster than other cryptocurrencies too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like Bitcoin.
Yeah. For example, Bitcoin transactions can take anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour to be confirmed.
Wow.
So the XRPL is significantly faster.
Okay.
Plus, it can handle a lot more transactions.
Okay.
It can process about 1,500 transactions per second.
Wow.
Compared to Bitcoin's 7 transactions per second.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
It is. It's like comparing a highway to a dirt road.
Yeah.
When it comes to how much traffic they can handle.
Okay.
And then there's the energy consumption.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, people are really concerned about that with cryptocurrencies.
Mm-hmm.
But the XRP Ledger uses a different kind of consensus mechanism. It's called the Ripple Protocol Consensus Algorithm, or RPCA.
RPCA.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it relies on a network of independent validators
Uh-huh.
to agree on transactions.
Okay.
And because it doesn't use proof of work like Bitcoin,
Right.
which requires a lot of computing power,
Yeah.
the XRPL uses much less energy.
So it's more environmentally friendly,
It is.
which is something that a lot of people are looking for these days.
Definitely.
So, how about the supply of XRP?
Okay.
Is it mined like Bitcoin?
No, it's not mined.
Okay.
XRP has a fixed supply of 100 billion tokens,
Okay.
and all of those tokens were created or pre-mined at the very beginning.
At the launch of the XRPL. So
Yeah.
that's different from Bitcoin, where new coins are constantly being created through mining.
That's right.
So how is XRP actually used within the XRP Ledger ecosystem?
Well, it has a few important functions.
Okay.
First, it's used to pay transaction fees.
Okay.
So every transaction on the network costs a tiny amount of XRP. And second, it helps prevent spam.
Okay.
To create an account on the XRPL, you need to hold a small amount of XRP.
Okay.
It's called a base reserve.
Okay.
And that's currently 1 XRP. It used to be 10,
Okay.
but they lowered it.
Okay.
And that basically stops people from creating tons of spam accounts,
Right.
which could mess up the network.
Okay.
And then, of course, as we talked about before, XRP is also meant to be used for faster and cheaper cross-border payments through on-demand liquidity.
ODL.
Yeah.
Okay, so it keeps the XRP Ledger running smoothly,
Mm-hmm.
and it helps keep it secure.
Yeah.
One of the sources mentioned the regulatory landscape around XRP.
Yeah.
What did we learn about that?
So this report,
Uh-huh.
which seems to be from late 2024,
Okay.
suggests that the regulatory outlook for crypto is improving,
Okay.
especially after the 2024 elections in the U.S.
Uh-huh.
And there's this belief that XRP in particular will get some relief from regulations and be able to compete more fairly.
That would be huge.
It would.
Did they mention any specific developments?
Yeah, there's this really interesting tidbit.
Okay.
The report says that as it was going to press, the Trump administration was planning to hold XRP as part of a strategic crypto reserve.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, we should be careful here because this was just a plan at that time.
Sure.
It wasn't actually implemented yet.
Right.
But it does show that the government might be warming up to XRP.
Yeah, that could be a sign of a more favorable regulatory environment.
It could be.
So let's talk about asset tokenization.
Okay.
One of our sources highlighted the XRPL's potential in that area.
Yeah. Asset tokenization is a really interesting concept.
Yeah, can you explain it for our listeners who might not be familiar with it?
Sure. Basically, it's about taking real-world assets,
Okay.
things like stocks or bonds or even real estate,
Uh-huh.
and turning them into digital tokens on a blockchain,
Okay.
in this case, the XRP Ledger. So it's like creating a digital representation of ownership that you can trade and manage on the blockchain.
So you could have a token that represents a share of Apple stock or a piece of a building,
Exactly.
and you could trade those tokens on the XRPL,
Yeah.
just like you trade cryptocurrencies today.
That's the idea.
That's really interesting.
And the XRPL has actually introduced something called multi-purpose tokens,
Okay.
which went live in December 2024.
Uh-huh.
And these tokens are specifically designed to represent different kinds of securities
Okay.
with all sorts of customizable features.
So you can do things like distribute dividends and manage voting rights.
Exactly.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's got the potential to really bridge the gap between traditional finance and DeFi.
Are there any other developments on the horizon for the XRPL in this area?
Yeah, there's something called the Native Lending Protocol,
Okay.
which is still being developed,
Okay.
but it's not live yet.
Okay.
And the goal is to create real-world credit products, like mortgages and loans,
Okay.
but using on-chain loans with fixed terms and interest rates.
So you're using the blockchain for the transaction itself,
Uh-huh.
but you're still using traditional methods for things like underwriting and risk assessment.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense.
And to make it even more appealing to regulated institutions, they're adding features like clawback and asset freezing.
Okay.
So you can regain control of tokens if something goes wrong,
Right.
or if there's some kind of legal issue.
So they're trying to address the concerns that regulators might have about this kind of technology.
Exactly.
Okay. So we've talked about partnerships.
Yeah.
We've talked about technology. One of our sources took a completely different approach and analyzed the actual flow of XRP transactions on the network.
Yes. That was a very interesting study.
Yeah, what did they find?
So they used a method called flow-weighted frequency
Okay.
to look at how regular participants in both the Bitcoin and XRP networks move their assets around.
So like the people who are constantly using the network.
Yeah, the regulars.
Okay.
And they looked at data from around the time of the 2017-2018 price peak.
Okay.
And they found that there were three main groups of participants.
Okay.
Those who were balancing their crypto holdings,
Okay.
those who were accumulating assets, and those who were reducing their holdings.
Okay.
And they call these groups the ball branch,
Okay.
the in branch,
Okay.
and the out branch.
Okay.
And they found this same pattern in both Bitcoin and XRP.
Interesting.
So even though they're different technologies,
Yeah.
the people using them seem to behave in similar ways.
Okay.
But they did notice one key difference.
Okay.
With Bitcoin, they saw what they called a regime switching around the price peak,
Okay.
where there was a shift from balancing to accumulating.
Uh-huh.
But they didn't see that same shift in XRP.
So maybe XRP holders are less reactive to price changes?
Yeah. Or maybe there's something else going on. But it's definitely something to keep in mind.
Okay.
And they also found that a surge in the number of participants across all three branches often happened right before the price peak for both Bitcoin and XRP.
Interesting. So maybe an increase in network activity could be a sign that a price move is coming?
It could be.
Okay.
It's not a guarantee, of course.
Sure.
But it's something to watch out for.
Okay. So let's talk about making the XRP Ledger more accessible to developers.
Okay.
One of our sources talked about smart contracts on the XRPL and a tool called Blockly 2 hooks.
Yeah, that's a really cool project.
Yeah. What's the idea behind that?
So the problem is that developing smart contracts can be really hard.
Yeah.
You know, you usually need to be a pretty experienced programmer. But Blockly 2 hooks is trying to change that.
Okay.
It uses Google's Blockly,
Okay.
which is a visual programming tool.
Okay.
So instead of writing code,
Uh-huh.
you can create smart contracts by dragging and dropping visual blocks.
So it's like a puzzle.
Kind of, yeah.
Okay.
You just connect the blocks together in the right way,
Uh-huh.
and it creates the code for you.
Okay, so you don't need to know any programming languages.
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
You can just focus on the logic of the contract.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a great way to make smart contracts more accessible to people who aren't programmers.
Okay.
And it also has some other potential benefits.
Okay.
Like it could make development faster and cheaper,
Uh-huh.
and it could even make contracts more secure.
Oh, okay. How so?
Well, if you don't have to write code,
Yeah.
you're less likely to make mistakes.
Right.
And the blocks are designed to be very clear and easy to understand.
Uh-huh.
So it's harder to accidentally create a contract that does something you didn't intend.
So it's like a safety net.
Coded, yeah.
Okay. Another interesting development we saw was the introduction of an XRP Futures contract.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
So it's a monthly cash-settled contract
Okay.
based on the market vector Coinbase XRP benchmark rate.
Okay.
And each contract represents 10,000 XRP.
Uh-huh.
And it's settled based on the benchmark rate at 4:00 p.m. London time on the settlement date.
Okay.
So basically it allows people to speculate on the future price of XRP
Uh-huh.
without actually having to hold any XRP.
Okay.
And the fact that it's cash settled makes it easier to settle.
Okay.
You know, you don't have to worry about actually delivering the XRP.
Right,
You just get paid in cash based on the price difference.
Okay.
And the benchmark rate that they use is regulated by BaFin in Germany,
Uh-huh.
and it follows the IOSASCO principles.
Okay.
So it's designed to be resistant to manipulation,
Okay.
and they also have position limits in place
Okay.
to prevent any one trader from having too much influence on the market.
So it's a more mature market for XRP
Yeah.
with more sophisticated trading instruments.
Definitely.
Finally, one of our sources did a direct investment analysis of XRP.
Yes.
What were the main findings there?
Well, this analysis looked at data up to early 2020,
Okay.
and it found that XRP had generated some pretty impressive returns historically,
Mm-hmm.
but it also came with a lot of volatility.
Yeah, that's not surprising.
Not really, no.
Did they look at diversification benefits?
They did,
Okay.
and they found that XRP had low or even negative correlation with some traditional assets.
Okay.
So including a small amount of XRP in a diversified portfolio
Mm-hmm.
could potentially reduce the overall risk,
Okay.
but they also stress the importance of rebalancing.
Right.
Because if you don't rebalance,
Yeah.
the volatility of XRP could actually hurt your portfolio.
So it's a high risk, high reward kind of investment.
It seems that way.
Okay. So to sum up, it seems like Ripple has done a great job building a network with RippleNet.
Yeah.
But the actual use of XRP by banks is still limited.
Yeah, that's fair to say.
There are regulatory hurdles,
Uh-huh.
and there's competition from other technologies.
Right.
But the technology behind XRP is impressive.
It is.
And it has potential in areas like asset tokenization.
Definitely.
So for anyone following XRP, it's important to track the real-world adoption of ODL,
Absolutely.
not just the number of partnerships.
That's the key.
The research into transaction flows is also really fascinating.
Yeah.
It gives us some insight into how the market works,
Yeah.
and the development of smart contracts on the XRPL could open up all sorts of new possibilities.
Yeah, it's exciting to see where this technology is going.
Yeah. So for you, our listener, remember that the relationship between Ripple and banks and the role of XRP within that relationship is complex.
Yeah.
It's not as simple as partnerships equaling adoption.
Right.
Keep an eye on the regulations
Uh-huh.
and look for real-world use cases.
Definitely.
Those are the things that will determine XRP's future.
That's right.
So as the regulatory landscape becomes clearer and the benefits of blockchain technology become more apparent, what role do you see for XRP and other digital assets in the future of finance?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a fast-moving space, and it's going to be fascinating to see how it all plays out.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next time on Crypto Chronicles.